The Hawk is Flying by Harry Crews. I was jogging between Lake Swan and Lake Rosa on a ridge full of blackjack oak when I saw the hawk, tail feathers fanned and wings half spread, beside a clump of palmetto about 20 yards off the dim path. From the attitude of her wings and tail, I first thought she was sitting on a kill, maybe a rabbit or a rat. But then she turned her wild dandelion eyes toward me, and I knew that she was there in the sand not because of something she had killed, but because she herself had almost been killed. Blood was dark and clotted on the trailing edge of her right wing. Some hunter had brought her down with a gun and then not had the decency to find where she fell. I stood there in the path for a long time, deciding whether or not to kill her. I knew the chances of keeping her alive were slim after she'd been hurt, but leaving her wings shot in the dirt like that would take more meanness than I thought I could manage. At the same time, though, I knew the right thing to do would be to step quickly across the sand and kick her to death. I watched her where she sat quietly, feathers ruffled now and unafraid, and I knew I was not going to find it in myself either to leave her or kill her. There was nothing to do but take her up and try to save her. Because the direct stare of a man is terrifying to a hawk, I kept my eyes averted and slowly circled to the edge of the palmetto, where I knelt in the sand. Her sharp, hooked beak was open from heat and exhaustion, and her peach-colored tongue beat like a pulse with her rapid breathing. From her size and plumage, she was obviously a red-tailed hawk less than 2 years old and in her prime. But even so, she would have a nervous system as fine and as delicate as a Swiss watch and be subject to death by heart attack or apoplexy. She was not handled carefully. I would need not only whatever skill I might have, but also enormous luck, since she would rather die than submit to me. Moving very slowly, so as not to disturb her any more than was absolutely necessary, I took off one of my shoes and rolled down a long, one-size-fits-all sweat sock I was wearing. Then, moving the hand that held the sock out in front of her so that she would follow it with her eyes, I eased my other hand over her back and pinned her wings down so she could not beat them against the ground. Her shallow, rapid heart trembled under the fine, bright feathers of her breast. I tore the toe out of the sock and put it around her neck like a collar and rolled it down until she was encased in a tight tube of elastic cotton. All that was visible was her head at one end of the sock and talons at the other. On the long, slow walk back home, the only sound she made was a soft clucking, very much like that of a chicken. I held her as loosely as I could because I was worried about the heat of my hands and the way she was wrapped. I really expected her to die, but apparently she was not hurt as badly as I thought. By the time I put her on my bed, her breathing had slowed and she had grown calm under the tight sock. I sat down and opened my desk, and there, nearly filling the bottom drawer, was leather from all the years I had kept and trained and flown hawks. On top was a pair of leather welder's gloves, the right one blood-stained between the thumb and forefinger. And under the gloves were several pairs of 18-inch jesses and 2 4-foot leashes and 15 hoods, each one with the size and date it was cut into the top of it. And finally, 4 tiny brass falcon bells and as many shark swivels, used to join the jesses to the leashes. I took the hoods out of the drawer and arbitrarily selected number 7 to fit to the hawk's head to see if it was light tight. It was too big, so I tried the next one down, number 6, which was nearly right. When I went to number 5, the fit was perfect, so I drew the leather hood strings, and the hawk, in total darkness now, lay utterly still. With a pair of scissors, I carefully cut away the sock. I put on the leather gloves with my right hand under her breast, lifted her to stand on the floor. In the darkness and confusion of the light-tight hood, she stood without moving while I looped the leather jesses around her legs and attached one of the bells to a tail feather. I then attached the ends of the 2 jesses to the shark swivel and hooked the other end of the swivel to a leash. Her blood-clotted wing hung half-spread from her body. I ran my fingers gently along the leading edge to see whether or not the bone was broken. It was not. The flesh was torn, but not badly, and I was able to remove 4 tiny bird shot from the wound with a pair of tweezers without cutting away any of her feathers. With a leather glove covering my wrist, I touched her legs from behind, and as all hawks will do, she immediately stepped up and back, her talons gripping my arm tightly enough to hurt through the 1/4-inch leather. It has always seemed an awesome mystery to me that any hooded hawk anywhere in the world will step in precisely the same way if the backs of its legs are touched. It was true when Attila the Hun carried hawks on his wrists, and it is still true. Presumably, it is something that will be true forever. It is part of the reason men have been fascinated with the art of falconry through all the centuries of recorded history. The hood was the only way I could possibly keep her while her wing healed, because without the hood she would beat herself to death at the end of the jesses. A hood makes a hawk's movements and reactions predictable, but there is something about it that is disgusting too. To make a hawk as docile as a kitten, to reduce even the biggest and most magnificent raptor in the world to something any child can carry, has always caused a sour ball of shame to settle solid as bone inside me. I made a perch for her out of a broomstick attached to the top of a ladder-backed chair and put her on it. She gripped the perch and sat as still as if she had been killed and stuffed. Eventually she would move, but only a little. She would lower her head and rake at the hood with her talons, but not for long, and the period of quietness would give her some chance of staying alive until she healed. I drew the blinds on the windows and stood watching her in the darkened room, thinking again of the perverse pleasure and unreasonable joy, dating all the way back to my childhood, that I have found in meat-eating birds. One of my most vivid memories is of riding bareback on a mule in the pine woods of South Georgia and seeing a buzzard walk out of the stomach of a dead and bloated cow, a piece of putrid flesh caught in its stinking beak. And right behind that memory is a hawk swinging into our farmyard and driving its talons into the back of a screaming chicken and flying toward the darkened tree line on the horizon. And necessarily linked to that memory is my grandmother immediately cooping up all the chickens except one puny biddy left unprotected in the yard with arsenic on its head for the same hawk to come back later and take away toward the same dark tree line, never to be seen again. A bird that drinks blood and eats flesh seemed to me then, and seems to me now, an aberration of nature. And I have always thought it must be for this very reason that I have been driven to capture, train, and fly hawks, to participate in the thing that I find so abhorrently and consistently beautiful. I left their room and let the hawk sit in silence for the rest of the day and that night. I knew there was some danger she might die of shock or thirst, but unless she was kept still so the damaged wing could start to heal, she would surely die from exertion. Toward the end of the next day, I went down to a feed store and bought a biddy and carried it dead into the room where the hawk sat on her perch, more alert now, shaking the bell with her tail feathers and holding the damaged wing closer to her body and turning her hooded head toward me as I came to the perch. The blinds were still drawn, and I knew after the long blind night of the hood she would not be afraid of me if I did not look directly at her and made no sudden movements. I held the biddy between the thumb and forefinger of my right hand while I slipped the strings at the back of the hood and drew it away from her head. I held the biddy about 6 inches away from the perch and stood very still while the hawk raised the feathers on her head and looked from the glove to my averted face and back again. She had to be hungry, perhaps dangerously so, but I was not going to feed her unless she stepped to my hand. I was not surprised when she had not taken that step after I had held the food in front of her for nearly an hour. Finally, I backed quietly to the door and left her sitting unhooded in the darkened room. I didn't know how long it would take before she stepped to my glove to eat. But she had to do it, or I could never release her and let her fly free again. The problem was simple enough, and even easy to solve if she would just cooperate. If she did not lose her fear of me and step to my glove to eat, would not be able to work her to a lure. And if I could not work her to a lure, I'd never be able to strengthen her wing enough so she could hunt for herself again, because it would take from 3 weeks to a month of inactivity for her wing to heal, and after she sat on a perch for a month, she wouldn't even be able to fly to the top of a tree, much less catch a darting rabbit. The choice was brutally necessary. Either she lost her fear of me and ate off my glove, or I would starve her to death. Fortunately, most birds of prey, except owls, which are too dumb to do much with, react favorably to patience and calm persistence. After 2 days on a perch without food, half the time wearing the hood I had put on her to accustom her to it, the hawk stepped to my glove and ate the biddy right down to the feet. The next day I gave her strips of beef heart and began taking her outside and fastening her leash to a block of wood, where she could weather the sun and bathe from time to time in a shallow pan of water. There are a few things in the world more beautiful to me than a hawk rising from the water and slowly turning in the sun, wings stretched and fanning on the air. There was no infection, and even though the red-tailed hawk did finally lose 2 of her flight feathers, she was soon flying the length of her leash to my glove. But her eyes and feathers were dull, and she was extremely weak. With no work, her appetite had gotten smaller and smaller until she was eating barely enough to stay alive. 20 days after I brought her home, I decided to start flying her to a lure. I didn't think she was ready for it, but I was afraid she was going to die if she didn't start taking more food, and the only way she was going to do that was if I worked her. The lure is a pillow-shaped piece of leather with a freshly killed chicken's head tied to it with a nice bit of bloody meat. I introduced her to the lure in the room where I kept her, letting her fly to it and eat with it caught between the thumb and forefinger of my glove. When she had become thoroughly accustomed to it, I let her go entirely without food for 30 hours and then took her to a wide, empty field and set her on a portable perch. I fastened her jesses to a 20-foot length of light but very strong nylon cord. From a distance of about 7 feet, I showed her the lure, swung it round and round before finally offering it to her on the glove. Her bobbing head followed the bloody meat, and then, giving a short, startled cry, she flew to it, her talons stretched and ready. By the end of 2 weeks, I had lengthened the nylon cord to 60 yards. At first, there were a few lapses when she swerved away from the lure and headed straight up, but she didn't have to be jerked out of the air many times by the cord before she was convinced she was somehow irrevocably joined to me and the lure. "5 weeks after I took her crippled and bleeding out of the sand, she was flying free, diving at the lure as I swung it in long arcs over my head, finally catching it high in the air and powering to the ground with it. As she sat on the lure eating, I would quietly walk to her and touch the backs of her legs with the glove, and she would step up and back, finishing her meal on my arm. I kept her longer than I needed to because I had come to love her, probably because she did not love me and never would. She was as wild as the day I flew her free as she was the day I found her. Hawks are not your friend and do not want to be. They are incapable of love, and I have for a long time thought that was precisely why I so much loved them. One Sunday morning, trying to do it mechanically and without thought, I drove 60 miles to the Okefenokee swamp with the hawk hooded so she would stay quiet. When I had taken the canoe 5 hours deep in the backwater cypress, I unclipped the falconer's bell, slipped her jesses, removed the hood, and threw her from my wrist toward the bright blue sky. I had taken her as deep into the swamp as I could because she had lost her fear of man, and at least here she would have some chance of survival. But given the number of fools with guns, I did not think that chance very good, even though she had been freed in the middle of a national preserve. For a long time I heard her high trailing cry above me, but I never looked up. I felt bad enough as it was.